Teenage mom kicked out by parents is rescued by eccentric elderly woman. What happens next is beautiful. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Maria had always been a bright and ambitious teenager. She had big dreams, a promising future ahead of her. Before everything changed, she was the kind of girl who would spend hours at the library, planning her career, imagining a life where anything was possible. But life, as it often does, had a different plan. It all started when she found out she was pregnant. At first, it felt like a bad dream. Maria had barely turned 17, and the reality of what was happening hit her like a wave. She didn't know how to tell her parents. She was terrified of their reaction, but she knew she couldn't hide it forever. Her parents, hardworking and deeply traditional, had always planned out a different path for her, a path that didn't include an unplanned pregnancy. They had always stressed the importance of education, of building a future. They wanted her to go to college, to have a career, to chase her dreams, not raise a child of her own. When Maria finally told them, the silence that followed was deafening. Her father was the first to speak, his voice low and filled with disappointment. Her mother sat quietly, tears welling in her eyes, struggling to understand how things had gone so wrong. The tension between them built slowly at first, like the crackling before a storm. Maria's parents tried to make her see that she wasn't ready, that this wasn't the life they'd envisioned for her. They questioned her choices, their voices sharp with concern. But underneath it all, there was something else. Disappointment, the kind that cuts deep. And then it happened. The words flew faster now, sharper, more hurtful. Maria felt as if her heart was being torn in two, as if every dream she had was slipping away, piece by piece. Her parents' words were no longer just about disappointment. They were accusations, about responsibility, about failure. And Maria, overwhelmed and desperate to prove herself, shouted back, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't ask for this," she cried. "I didn't plan any of this. But it's happening. I'm going to take care of my baby, and I don't need anyone's judgment." The silence that followed was suffocating. Her mother turned away, not able to meet her eyes, and her father stood rigid, staring at the floor, his fists clenched. Finally, her father spoke, his voice cold. "You've made your choice. Now you'll have to live with it. You're on your own, Maria." And just like that, the door slammed. She was kicked out of the house. Alone, confused, and terrified, Maria grabbed a few things and left, feeling the weight of her parents' disappointment pressing heavily on her chest. The streets were cold, and the world around her felt like it was collapsing. She had nowhere to go, no plan, no resources. Just a sense of helplessness she had never known before. For days, Maria wandered through the city, finding shelter wherever she could. Her stomach was constantly in knots, not just from the uncertainty of where she'd sleep, but from the overwhelming fear of what kind of future her baby would have. She couldn't escape the judgmental stares of passers-by, the whispers behind her back. She knew what they thought. A teenager, alone, pregnant, with no support. It was on one of those nights when she was sitting on a bench, staring at the dark sky, that she met her. The elderly woman appeared out of nowhere, moving slowly but with a certain grace. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, mismatched clothes that didn't quite make sense together, and she had a look in her eyes that seemed to see right through Maria's facade. "Cold night for a young one like you," the woman said, sitting beside her. Maria had been so absorbed in her own thoughts that she barely noticed her at first. But the woman's voice was warm, kind in a way that Maria hadn't felt in days. There was something about her, something that felt different from the judgment Maria had faced earlier. "You don't look like you're from around here," the woman continued, her voice calm, like a quiet stream flowing through the chaos of Maria's thoughts. Maria hesitated, but something in the woman's gentle presence made her open up. She found herself telling her about everything, the fight with her parents, the coldness she felt, and how she had nowhere to go. The woman listened patiently, nodding along, as though hearing stories like this were a regular occurrence. When Maria finished, the woman placed a wrinkled hand on her shoulder. "I've got a place," she said. "You don't need to be out here, not like this. Come with me." Maria blinked, confused and overwhelmed. She had never met someone so unafraid to offer help to a stranger. She wanted to ask questions, to refuse, but something about the woman's warmth, the sincerity in her eyes, made her take a step forward. And so, with nothing left but a glimmer of hope, Maria followed her, unsure of what the future would hold. But knowing one thing for certain, this woman, this eccentric stranger, had just opened a door to something new. Maria had never imagined that her life would take such a sharp turn. Abandoned by her family with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, she was left in a state of constant turmoil. The streets were unrelenting, cold in ways she hadn't prepared for. It wasn't just the biting chill of the night air that wore her down. It was the loneliness, the uncertainty of her future, and the fear of becoming another face in a crowd of forgotten souls. She had wandered for hours, unsure of where she was going, lost in the blur of her thoughts. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of her situation was bearing down on her all at once. And then, there she was, standing in front of a small house, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light. Maria barely noticed how she had arrived at the doorstep, her legs moving almost instinctively, as if they knew this was the place she needed to be. The elderly woman, this stranger who had offered Maria a place to stay, wasn't what she expected. When she first saw her, Maria thought she might be imagining things. The woman was a puzzle of contradictions. Tall, with a hunched back, she moved with an air of slow, deliberate grace. Her clothes, a patchwork of bright colors and mismatched patterns, seemed like something out of a different era. A wide-brimmed hat perched on her head, its edges frayed with age, but it only added to her eccentric charm. As Maria hesitated at the doorstep, unsure of what to expect, the door creaked open, and the elderly woman's face appeared, framed by the dim light behind her. "Well, you look like you've been through quite a lot," the woman said, her voice light, almost whimsical. Maria blinked, taken aback by the woman's bluntness. I didn't mean to intrude," Maria stammered, her voice shaky. She was still reeling from the events of the last few hours. Her parents' rejection, the hurtful words, the overwhelming uncertainty. The elderly woman gave a small, knowing smile. "You didn't. And you're welcome here, child. Come in. Come in. It's cold out there." With little more than a curious glance, Maria stepped over the threshold, unsure of what awaited her, but feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of warmth. The house was an oddity in itself, an eclectic mix of trinkets, mismatched furniture, and books stacked high in every corner. It felt like stepping into another world entirely, a world that Maria couldn't quite place. Yet there was something strangely comforting about it, something that whispered safe in a way that she hadn't heard in weeks. "Sit, sit," the elderly woman urged, her voice a comforting melody as she gestured to a faded armchair by the fire. She moved with surprising agility, considering her age, and began to brew tea, humming to herself as though nothing in the world could trouble her. Maria took a seat, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't sure what to make of the woman or what she was getting herself into. She had learned long ago not to trust easily. Trust had been the one thing her parents had taken away from her. But as the tea brewed and the soft crackling of the fire filled the silence, Maria couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace in the woman's presence. There was no judgment here, no questions about why she was alone or why she had no place to go. The elderly woman simply seemed to know what Maria needed: comfort, warmth, and a quiet place to heal. As the days passed, Maria began to see the eccentricity of the elderly woman not as something strange, but as a source of wisdom. The woman spoke in riddles at times, her words playful yet deep, as though she were always trying to teach Maria something without actually saying it. She would share stories about her own life, her own struggles, and the lessons she had learned along the way. And while Maria didn't always understand her, there was something undeniably magnetic about her. There were moments when Maria would catch the woman staring at her with an odd, knowing smile, as if she saw something in Maria that Maria herself couldn't yet see. "The world doesn't always give us what we want, child," the woman would say, her eyes twinkling behind her thick glasses. "But it always gives us what we need." Maria didn't fully grasp what the woman meant at first, but over time she began to. Slowly she realized that the woman wasn't just giving her shelter. She was giving her something far more precious, a chance to rediscover herself. Still, Maria was cautious. It was hard to let go of the fear that had gripped her since she had been kicked out. She was afraid to trust, afraid that this too would slip through her fingers like everything else. But day by day, the woman's kindness began to break down. The walls Maria had so carefully built around herself. One evening, as they sat together in silence, Maria couldn't help but feel a swell of emotion rise in her chest. The weight of the last few weeks, the rejection, the loneliness, felt lighter somehow. It was as though in this strange woman's company, she could finally exhale. She had spent so long fighting to hold herself together, but here, in the woman's presence, she didn't have to. "I don't know what to do anymore," Maria confessed one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've failed everyone. I don't know how to be a mother, and I don't know how to do this without my parents." The elderly woman, without missing a beat, placed a hand on hers, gentle but firm. "You're not alone, child. You'll find your way just like I did. It may not look like what you expected, but it will be your way. And that's enough." In that simple moment, something in Maria shifted. She realized that she wasn't as broken as she had thought. There was still strength in her, and the bond she had started to form with this eccentric stranger was helping her find it again. When Maria first arrived at the elderly woman's doorstep, she had nothing but fear and uncertainty. The streets had been unkind, and her future felt like a shadow she could never outrun. But now, in the quiet warmth of this small home, things were beginning to change. She had a roof over her head, food on the table, and a place to rest. But what weighed on her the most was the responsibility of caring for her baby. Maria had no idea how to be a mother, how to care for a child, to nourish her, to make sure she had everything she needed. Each day was a new challenge, and she felt completely out of her depth. She often stared at her baby, her heart filled with love but also dread. Could she really do this? Could she be the mother her baby deserved? That's where the elderly woman stepped in. She didn't just offer Maria a place to stay, she offered her something more, something far more valuable. She became a mentor, a guide, and a friend. In the early mornings, as the house filled with the smell of freshly brewed tea, the elderly woman would patiently teach Maria the simple, everyday skills she needed to survive and thrive. She showed Maria how to make hearty meals from the few ingredients they had, how to clean and organize a small home, and most importantly, how to budget, making sure that every penny was spent wisely. Maria learned more than just practical skills. The elderly woman's lessons were laced with quiet wisdom, and every chore became an opportunity for growth. "You take care of your home, and your home will take care of you," she would say, her voice soft but firm. As Maria stood over the stove, stirring a pot of soup or chopping vegetables, she began to understand something fundamental. She was capable. She wasn't just a teenager lost in a chaotic world. She was a mother, and her responsibility to her baby was shaping her into someone stronger than she'd ever known. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Maria had spent so much time feeling small, invisible, overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood and the judgment of the world. But now with each day, she felt a quiet strength rising within her. She began to wake up early, not just to care for her baby, but to care for herself as well. She washed her face, brushed her hair, and started each day with purpose, knowing that it wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the exhaustion would overwhelm her, when the weight of responsibility felt too much to bear. But then the elderly woman would come beside her, offering a kind word or a gentle touch, reminding her that she wasn't alone. Maria was learning to manage her time, to set priorities, and to see the possibilities in every new challenge. She learned to stretch a dollar, to make meals that nourished both body and soul, and how to make her small world feel like home. But it wasn't just about managing the household. It was about finding her own way, her own independence. The elderly woman, with her quirky ways, never pushed Maria too hard, but she always knew when it was time to nudge her forward. "Get out there," she would say, her voice playful but serious. "You've learned how to take care of your own home. Now go take care of the world outside." At first, Maria hesitated. She had no experience, no formal education, and certainly no network to rely on. But the elderly woman's words lingered in her mind. Maria knew she couldn't stay in this little house forever. She needed to find a job, to stand on her own 2 feet, to prove to herself that she was capable. With the elderly woman's encouragement, Maria began to look for work. She started small, applying for part-time jobs, taking whatever she could get. The first few weeks were difficult, filled with rejection and self-doubt. She would come home, tired and discouraged, but the elderly woman would always be there, ready to lift her spirits. "You're getting closer," she would say as Maria slumped into a chair discouraged. "The right opportunity will come. Just keep knocking on doors." And so Maria did. Then one day, after what felt like endless hours of searching, the breakthrough came. Maria got a job at a local cafe. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the career she had dreamed of, but it was a start. It was a sign that her hard work, her persistence, was paying off. The first paycheck she received was more than just money. It was proof that she could do this. She could be a mother and hold down a job. She could create a life for herself and her baby. And as she looked at the elderly woman, who was sitting quietly, observing with a proud smile on her face, Maria realized something. She wasn't just surviving. She was building a new life, piece by piece. She was stronger than she had ever believed. That night, as the two of them sat together at the kitchen table, Maria held up her first paycheck, her eyes glistening with a newfound pride. "I did it," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. The elderly woman reached over and squeezed her hand, her smile warm but knowing. "You always could, Maria. You just needed to believe it." In the beginning, Maria had been in survival mode. The shock of being abandoned by her family still weighed heavily on her. Each day was a battle to keep her baby fed, a battle to keep her emotions in check, a battle to hold on to any shred of hope. The world outside the safety of the elderly woman's home felt like an endless maze of uncertainty. But inside these walls she had found solace. In the kindness of a stranger who had offered her refuge, Maria had begun to rebuild her life, brick by brick. With each lesson she learned, each meal prepared, each bill paid, each moment of vulnerability shared, Maria felt a part of her old self coming back. And yet something lingered, an unspoken mystery about the woman who had opened her door to her. Maria knew bits and pieces of the elderly woman's life, how she had lived alone for many years, how her house was filled with oddities and stories that seemed half forgotten. But beyond that, the elderly woman had been careful not to reveal much of herself. She was like a puzzle, each piece tantalizingly close yet just out of reach. One evening, as the air turned crisp and the light from the fireplace cast long shadows across the room, the elderly woman's voice broke the silence. "You've been so good to me, Maria," she said, her voice soft but with an edge of weariness. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something about me that I think you should know." Maria had never heard the elderly woman speak like this before. Her words were slow, deliberate, as if she were carefully choosing each one. There was an air of gravity in her tone that made Maria set her cup down, leaning in just a little, instinctively bracing herself for what was to come. The elderly woman sighed deeply, her wrinkled hands folding together in her lap. Her eyes, though full of life, seemed distant for a moment, as though she were looking at something far beyond the walls of the room. "I wasn't always like this, you know," she began, her voice tinged with a melancholy that Maria had never noticed before. "I had a life before, a different life." Maria listened intently, the weight of the moment settling over them both. The elderly woman rarely spoke about her past, and when she did, it was always in passing, as though it was something she didn't wish to revisit. "Before I came here, I had a family," the elderly woman continued. "A husband, a daughter. We were happy, at least. We thought we were. I lost them both in a car accident," she said, her voice faltering for just a moment before she regained her composure. "My world shattered that day. My husband, and then my daughter not long after. I was left with nothing but grief." Maria's mind raced, trying to grasp the magnitude of what the elderly woman had just shared. To have lost everything, her family, her future, was a pain Maria could not fully comprehend, but she could feel the depth of it in the silence that followed. The elderly woman paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then her gaze softened, and she looked at Maria, as though seeing her for the first time. After the accident, I tried to rebuild, but the loneliness, it never truly left, she said, her voice steady now. That's why I keep my house the way it is, full of things that remind me of them. It's my way of keeping their memory alive. Maria sat still, her thoughts swirling as she absorbed the rawness of the woman's words. For so long, she had seen the elderly woman as someone who simply offered shelter, someone who had been there when Maria needed a place to stay. But now, as she heard the story of her pain and resilience, the woman began to take on a new role in Maria's life. Not just as a savior, but as a living testament to survival, to strength. It wasn't just that the elderly woman had saved her. It was that she had lived through unimaginable loss and had chosen to keep moving forward, to keep living. Maria began to see her not just as someone who had helped her when she was down, but as a role model, someone who had fought her own battles and come out stronger on the other side. But just as Maria began to process what she had learned, the elderly woman's voice broke the quiet once more, this time with a sharpness that caught Maria off guard. "There's one more thing," she said, her tone serious. "A secret, one I've never told anyone before. I'm not just an eccentric old woman who's lived alone for years," the elderly woman continued, her eyes locked on Maria's. "I used to be something else entirely. I, I used to be very wealthy. My family had money, influence, connections. And then it all disappeared because of a choice I made." Maria's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of this woman's past. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The elderly woman's lips trembled slightly, her eyes haunted. "I was once a businesswoman, successful in my own right. But I made decisions that ruined everything. I lost everything. My family, my wealth, my reputation. I chose love over money, and it cost me everything." The truth hung in the air, heavy and raw. Maria felt a strange mix of disbelief and awe. This woman, who seemed so simple, so content with her humble life, had once lived a life of privilege and power. She had given it all up for love, and now lived in quiet solitude, far from the riches and status she once held. Maria sat in stunned silence, the weight of the elderly woman's revelation settling over her like a storm. She had always seen her as an eccentric, a quirky older woman with strange habits. But now she understood that there was so much more beneath the surface, so much more to her story than Maria had ever realized. And in that moment, something shifted inside Maria. She had come to this woman for help, for shelter. But now, as she processed the depth of the elderly woman's past and the resilience that had carried her through, Maria realized that she was not just here to receive. She was here to give, to help, to return the kindness she had been shown. As Maria looked out at the horizon, she realized that this was no longer just about her own survival. She had the strength to help the woman who had saved her, to give back in ways she had never thought possible. Life had a way of surprising you, of bringing people together when you least expected it. And for the first time in a long while, Maria believed that she too could be a source of light in someone else's darkness. Maria had never imagined her life would come to this. Only days ago, she had been surrounded by the comforts of home, her family, her friends, her hopes for a future. But that world had shattered in an instant when her parents had turned their backs on her, disgusted by the unexpected pregnancy. The abandonment stung in ways she could never have predicted. It wasn't just the loss of a roof over her head. It was the loss of love, of the familiar sense of belonging. She had always imagined that, no matter what, her parents would be there for her. But they weren't. And in their absence, Maria was left standing on the precipice of a future she was not prepared to face. She had no money, no place to go, no one to turn to. The weight of her situation was almost too much to bear as she navigated the streets with her newborn, each step forward feeling heavier than the last. The streets were a cold, indifferent place for a young girl with a baby in her arms. Her days were filled with worry. Where would they sleep tonight? How could she feed her child? Every time she stopped to rest, she felt the harsh reality of her situation, the discomfort of sleeping in dark alleyways or under the cover of a park bench. The world was moving on without her, and with every passing hour, the weight of her decisions, of her life choices, pressed harder and harder on her chest. She was just trying to survive, just trying to make it through the day. Then, just as hope seemed a distant memory, something shifted. In the distance, a figure appeared. A woman, older, with wild silver hair and a strange, knowing look in her eyes. Maria hadn't seen her before, but there was something about her presence that caught her attention. The elderly woman watched her for a moment, then slowly approached, her steps purposeful but kind. She didn't seem afraid, didn't flinch at the sight of the young mother struggling in the cold. There was something unspoken in her gaze, a sense of understanding that transcended words. The elderly woman steps closer, her voice soft but firm. "Are you all right, dear?" she asks, her eyes scanning Maria's face with an almost unsettling accuracy. "You look like you could use some help." Nah, Maria hesitated. She learned to trust very few people in her life, especially not strangers. But something about the elderly woman's demeanor made her pause. The desperation that had clouded Maria's judgment seemed to lift for just a moment, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "Please." Maria's voice cracks as she struggles to speak, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. I don't know where else to go. I'm just trying to care for my baby." The elderly woman's expression softens, and without another word, she gestures for Maria to follow her. "Come with me. You don't have to do this alone." Maria glances around, still hesitant, but the warmth in the woman's eyes convinces her to take the first step. And so they walk together through the cold night, Maria's arms aching with her baby, the elderly woman's steps sure and steady beside her. The woman led Maria to a small, modest house at the edge of the neighborhood. It was unassuming, a place that felt far removed from the chaos and the noise of the world outside. The door creaks open, and the woman gestures for Maria to enter. The smell of something warm and inviting wafts through the door. "Welcome," the elderly woman says, her voice a little softer now. "This is where you'll stay for as long as you need." Maria stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. The space was humble, cozy even. But there was something unusual about it. The walls were adorned with strange trinkets, antique furniture, and odd collections of objects that seemed out of place. A faint aroma of herbs and something sweet lingered in the air. The elderly woman turned to her with a smile. "I have rules here," she said, her tone light but serious. "First, you'll help around the house. Cleaning, cooking, simple tasks. Second, you'll learn how to be resourceful. I don't have much, but I know how to make it last. Third, no complaints. If you want to stay here, you'll need to help yourself as much as I'll help you." Maria nodded, not fully understanding what the woman meant, but grateful for the offer nonetheless. She was tired and she had no other choice but to accept. As the days passed, the elderly woman kept to her word. She taught Maria how to stretch every resource, and how to make the most out of nothing. With patience and a certain eccentricity, the woman showed her how to cook meals from scratch, how to clean in the most efficient way, and how to budget the little money they had. These lessons weren't just about survival. They were about reclaiming a sense of control. The elderly woman's methods were unconventional, to say the least. She didn't hold back on her advice, whether it was about practical matters or deeper life lessons. She spoke of self-reliance, of never waiting for things to happen, and of embracing change with an open heart. Her wisdom was surprising, and Maria slowly began to feel a shift within herself. Her days now had a rhythm, waking up early, tending to her baby, completing chores, and learning the tricks of survival. But there was something more at play here. The elderly woman's presence was beginning to fill the gaps that Maria hadn't even realized were there. One afternoon, as the elderly woman shows Maria how to plant herbs in the small garden outside, the older woman turns to her with a mischievous glint in her eye. "You've got potential, Maria," she says, her voice light. "But potential means nothing if you don't use it." It was then that Maria began to see the future with new eyes. The elderly woman wasn't just giving her a place to stay, she was preparing her for a new chapter in her life. A chapter filled with possibility, even in the face of adversity. And just as Maria was starting to settle in, the elderly woman's next words would change everything. "Tomorrow we start looking for work," the woman says with a knowing smile. You've got what it takes to do more than just survive. It's time to make a living, and I'm going to help you." Maria stood there stunned for a moment before a new wave of determination washed over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. What started as a random encounter, a chance meeting on the streets, was now the beginning of something far bigger. For Maria, the elderly woman had opened a door to a future she never thought possible. And together they would face the challenges ahead, each step bringing them closer to the lives they were meant to lead. Maria felt like she was standing at a crossroads in her life. The choices before her seemed overwhelming. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about deciding who she wanted to become. Her family had turned their backs on her, her world had been upended, and now she found herself in the home of a stranger, someone who seemed so different from her, yet was offering her a chance at something she never thought possible, a future. But the loneliness still lingered, the weight of judgment, the whispers of society about young mothers, the shame of being abandoned. These things clouded her mind. Despite the care she had found in the elderly woman's home, there were moments when Maria couldn't escape the feeling of being different, of being an outsider. The world outside was full of people who didn't understand her, didn't know her struggles. And yet there was the elderly woman, always there, always ready to share a lesson, a story, a piece of wisdom. In her presence, Maria began to feel something shift inside her, a flicker of strength she hadn't known she had. The elderly woman was a force of nature, full of stories from a time long past. As Maria struggled to navigate her new life, the woman's words became a steadying presence, guiding her through each challenge. One evening, as the moonlight poured through the window and the room was bathed in a soft, silvery glow, the elderly woman began to speak again, her voice low and contemplative. "I was your age once," she said, her eyes soft as she looked at Maria. "I was scared too. In fact, I was more scared than I can put into words. But I found strength in the unlikeliest places, in the people I met, in the lessons I learned, and in the choices I made. And sometimes it's those very choices that define who we are." Maria looked up, intrigued. "What kind of choices?" The elderly woman chuckled, the sound warm and rich, as if her years had seasoned her laughter. "Oh, I wasn't always the wise old woman you see now," she said with a wink. "When I was young, I made all sorts of mistakes. I ran away from home at 16. I married the wrong man. I trusted the wrong people. But that's part of living. We all have to stumble, fall, and get back up." Maria listened closely, the stories of this woman's past becoming a bridge between their worlds. She was young, yes, but she wasn't the first to face hardship. In the elderly woman's tales of love, loss, and survival, Maria found echoes of her own life. The time periods were different, the details unique, but the emotions, the fears, the struggles remained the same. In exchange, Maria began to share her own story, the parts she had never spoken aloud to anyone else. The woman listened without judgment, nodding quietly as Maria recounted her fears, her doubts, and her hopes for her baby's future. Each conversation between them became a thread, weaving a bond stronger than Maria could have ever imagined. As the days passed, the lessons grew deeper. The elderly woman didn't just teach Maria practical skills. She taught her the importance of resilience, of finding peace in the chaos, of embracing the challenges life threw at them. She shared stories of how she had been judged for her own choices when she was young, how people looked down on her for marrying too young, for being a mother before she was ready. The stigma she faced back then was not so different from the judgment Maria felt now. "You see," the elderly woman said one day as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, "the world always has something to say about how we live our lives. People judge what they don't understand, but it's not their judgment that defines us. It's how we respond to it and how we learn from it." Maria looked down at her baby, a smile tugging at her lips. "I never thought I could be a good mom. I never thought I'd make it." The elderly woman placed a hand on Maria's, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "You're doing it. You're stronger than you know, Maria. Every mother has her doubts. It's not about doing it perfectly. It's about doing it with love, with care. And you have that in abundance." Through the wisdom of the elderly woman, Maria began to thrive. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't have all the answers, but she was learning to trust herself. She found strength in the lessons her unconventional new family had given her. She learned to stand tall, not just for herself, but for her baby. Together they faced the world. Together they battled the judgment of others, the whispers that followed Maria as she walked down the street with her baby in her arms. But they didn't let it define them. The elderly woman, with her strength and stories of survival, had shown Maria how to rise above it. The bond between the two women grew stronger with each passing day. They were from different generations with different experiences and perspectives. But in their shared strength, in their shared humanity, they had found a bond that transcended age. Each woman had something the other needed: Maria's youthful energy and determination, and the elderly woman's wisdom and experience. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about thriving, about creating a new family, one built not on blood, but on love, understanding, and shared experience. And so, as the days went by, and Maria continued to grow into her role as a mother, she knew that she wasn't alone. She had found a family in the most unlikely of places. And in the bond of generations, Maria found a strength that she never thought possible, a strength that would carry her through every challenge that lay ahead. Maria sitting on the edge of an old wooden chair, her gaze drifting toward the empty doorway. The weight of silence hangs heavy in the air, broken only by the sound of her baby's soft breathing. Her hands tremble slightly as she runs them over the fabric of her clothes, trying to steady herself. Maria had always imagined that, no matter what, her parents would be there for her. She had been raised in a home where love seemed to flow freely, where laughter filled the halls and the promise of family always felt strong. But that was before the pregnancy. That was before everything changed. Her parents' disappointment had been sharp, cutting deeper than anything she had ever felt. Their reaction wasn't just about disappointment, it was about shame, about an expectation of perfection that Maria couldn't meet. The harsh words they had spoken, the looks they had exchanged when they learned she was pregnant, left a mark on her heart that she couldn't erase. And in the end, it wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about their rejection of her, a rejection that shattered the foundation of the family she had always known. When her parents had kicked her out, it felt like the final blow. There had been no second chances, no room for understanding. The words they had said still echoed in her mind. "You've ruined everything." It wasn't just about the baby. It was about her, about the idea that she had failed them. The world, once familiar and safe, now felt cold and unwelcoming. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The weight of fear and loneliness settled into her bones, heavy and suffocating. Maria walks through the empty streets, her baby cradled carefully in her arms, her steps slow, unsure of where she is even heading. She doesn't know who she is anymore. She doesn't know who she's supposed to be in this new reality. It was in that moment, when Maria felt like the world had abandoned her, that the eccentric elderly woman appeared. The woman had watched Maria from a distance, seen the young mother struggle, and without hesitation, without a second thought, she had stepped forward and offered her help. Where others saw a lost, desperate girl, the elderly woman saw someone worth saving. She didn't ask for any explanation, didn't question her past. She simply opened her home and heart. The house wasn't much, but it was a sanctuary. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maria felt a sliver of safety, a place where she didn't have to prove herself, where she didn't have to justify her existence. It was a simple act of kindness that began to change everything. Over time, the connection between the two women grew. At first, Maria was hesitant. She didn't know if she could trust this stranger, but the elderly woman's consistent warmth, her unwavering support, began to break down the walls Maria had built around her heart. With every meal shared, every conversation had, Maria began to see this woman not as just a temporary savior, but as someone who might become something much more. The two women, separated by decades, began to form a bond that was deeper than either of them could have predicted. The elderly woman taught Maria how to care for herself, how to trust her instincts, and how to embrace the life that was now in front of her. In turn, Maria showed the elderly woman the joy of having someone to care for again, someone to nurture. They both gave and received in ways that neither had imagined. One evening, the two sit together at the kitchen table. the soft glow of candlelight illuminating their faces as they talk about their past. The elderly woman tells stories of her own struggles, of times when she too had felt abandoned and misunderstood. Maria listens, her heart softening as she realizes how much they share. They began to share more than just their experiences. They shared their hearts. The elderly woman wasn't just a caregiver to Maria. She became a guide, a teacher, and a friend. And in Maria, the elderly woman saw something she hadn't seen in years, a spark of youthful energy, a promise of a new beginning. Their lives were different in so many ways, but in their shared struggles, they found a connection that transcended age and background. Together, they formed a family, not by blood, but by choice. They built something more resilient than just survival. They built a new kind of love. It wasn't easy. There were still days when Maria felt overwhelmed, when she wondered if she was doing enough for her baby, if she was strong enough to face the challenges that lay ahead. But with the elderly woman by her side, she learned how to weather the storms. The bond they shared was tested by the world around them, the judgment from others, the societal pressures that weighed heavily on Maria's shoulders. But they didn't let that define them. They faced it together, standing tall against the world's harshness, supporting each other in a way that made them stronger. And slowly, Maria began to thrive. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning, growing, and finding strength in the unlikeliest of places. In the end, Maria found something she hadn't even realized she needed: a family. The elderly woman, with her wisdom and unconditional love, became the mother figure Maria had always yearned for. And Maria, with her youthful energy and determination, became the daughter the elderly woman had longed for. Together, they formed a family, one built on support, love, and resilience. A family that defied expectations, that rose from the ashes of abandonment, and that proved that the bonds of love don't have to be defined by blood. The moment Maria had been dreading had come to pass. Her parents, once the pillars of her world, had cast her out with words that felt like daggers. They had said she was a disappointment, that she had ruined everything, that there was no place for her in their lives anymore. Her heart ached as she sat there, alone on the cold concrete, feeling the sting of abandonment. She had always believed that family was the one thing that would never turn its back on her, but now that belief was shattered. As the minutes turned into hours, Maria felt the weight of her situation. No home, no support, and a baby depending on her for everything. The despair that clouded her heart seemed endless, and for a moment, she wondered if she would ever find her way out. But just as Maria was beginning to lose hope, a voice broke through the heavy silence. A voice that, though strange, seemed to offer the only glimmer of light in her dark world. The elderly woman appears on the scene, her steps slow but deliberate, her eyes filled with an unexpected warmth as she approaches Maria. "Why don't you come with me?" the elderly woman asks, her voice firm but kind. "I know it's not much, but at least you'll have a roof over your head." Maria looked up, surprised by the offer. The woman was peculiar, with her wild white hair and the way she carried herself, so full of energy despite her age. But there was something in her eyes, something that suggested she knew what it felt like to be lost, to be alone. And in that moment, despite her doubts, Maria made a choice. With nothing left to lose, she accepted the offer. The first days in the elderly woman's home were filled with uncertainty. The house was small, cozy even, but there were no luxuries, just the essentials. And the woman, though kind, wasn't what Maria had expected. She was full of strange advice, offering guidance in ways that Maria found unusual, sometimes even baffling. "Always keep your hands busy, Maria," she would say. "It's when we sit idle that the despair creeps in." And so Maria found herself doing things she never thought she would. Learning to cook meals from scratch, learning how to clean every nook and cranny of the house, even learning how to manage the little money she had. It wasn't what Maria had expected, but slowly something began to shift inside her. The woman's lessons were not just about surviving, they were about living. They were about building strength no matter how small the steps. As the days passed, the lessons became clearer. The elderly woman taught Maria more than just how to survive in a world that had abandoned her. She taught her how to take care of herself, how to find strength in the little things. And most importantly, how to start believing in the possibility of change. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were days when Maria felt like giving up, when the weight of her past and the harshness of her circumstances were too much to bear. But every time she felt like she was sinking, the elderly woman was there, offering her an unspoken promise that she wasn't alone. One step at a time, Maria. You'll find your way, she would say, as if her words were a lifeline that Maria could hold on to. Over time, Maria began to change. No longer defined by her past mistakes or the rejection she had faced, she found herself becoming more self-sufficient, more confident. The feelings of helplessness and despair started to fade, replaced by a quiet resilience that surprised even her. She began to take charge of her own life, starting small, but with each victory, her confidence grew. She learned to budget, to plan, and to think beyond survival. She realized that she had more power than she had ever given herself credit for. And then one day she stood before the elderly woman, her eyes filled with newfound determination. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to move forward." The elderly woman smiled, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "I knew you would be," she said. "You were always stronger than you thought." For the first time in a long while, Maria felt a sense of hope. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building a future, about dreaming again. She could see beyond the pain of her past, beyond the rejection, and into a future that was full of possibility. And as she looked at her baby, her heart swelled with a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a teenage mom anymore. She was a woman who had faced the darkest moments of her life and had come out stronger. She was a mother who was ready to give her child a better life. In the quiet moments of reflection, Maria knew that she had been given a second chance. The elderly woman had been the spark that reignited her hope. And now, with every step forward, Maria was creating a life that was entirely her own. The road ahead would still have challenges. Life rarely offers anything easy. But Maria was no longer afraid. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that even in the darkest moments, hope could be found. And with that hope, she could face anything that came her way. Maria had never imagined this kind of pain. Rejection from the people who should have supported her, the people who had promised to always be by her side. The reality of being a teenage mother, abandoned by her parents, hit harder than anything she'd ever experienced. Her world felt dark, uncertain, and full of fear. She was alone with nothing but a baby in her arms and a heart full of heartbreak. For days she wandered the streets, searching for any hint of comfort, but all she found was emptiness. She had no plan, no direction, only a desperate hope that someone, somehow, would take pity on her and show her a way out of the darkness. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, Maria encountered the elderly woman. Her presence was unexpected, quirky, even unpredictable, but there was something about her that made Maria pause. Despite her eccentricity, the elderly woman's kindness was undeniable. "I see you've been through a lot," the elderly woman had said, her voice soft but firm, as she stepped closer to Maria. "Come with me. You don't have to be alone anymore." At first, Maria hesitated. She didn't know this woman, didn't know if she could trust her. But in her heart, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The elderly woman's home wasn't much, but it felt like a safe haven, a place where Maria could breathe for the first time in days. The woman's home was small but filled with life, a reflection of the woman herself. There were strange knickknacks on every shelf, old books stacked high, and the scent of freshly brewed tea always in the air. She didn't ask questions about Maria's past. Instead, she focused on offering what little she could: a warm meal, a comfortable bed, and something much more important: kindness. Maria slowly began to relax in the presence of the elderly woman. Her quirky ways, her strange advice, the unexpected laughter they shared. They all became a balm for Maria's wounded heart. With each passing day, the weight of abandonment seemed a little less heavy, the darkness a little less consuming. The healing process wasn't immediate. At first, Maria didn't know how to let go of the pain, the shame, the guilt that had been placed on her shoulders. But the elderly woman never pushed her to heal faster than she was ready. Instead, she patiently offered her guidance. never with force, but with an unwavering kindness that allowed Maria to open up in her own time. Kindness is a powerful thing, Maria, the elderly woman would often say, her voice laced with wisdom. It can heal wounds that no medicine can touch, but first you must be willing to accept it. As the days turned into weeks, Maria found herself not only accepting the kindness being offered to her, but beginning to believe in it. And as she allowed herself to heal, something began to shift within her. The strength she had thought she had lost was slowly returning. With the elderly woman's support, Maria began to see a future for herself and her baby. She started learning new skills, things that would help her take charge of her life. The elderly woman, with her unconventional teachings, helped Maria discover her own abilities, everything from managing her finances to crafting simple handmade goods. The lessons were unexpected, but they brought clarity. Soon, Maria started to create something for herself, an idea, a dream that she hadn't even dared to think about before. The elderly woman's quirky advice about turning passion into a livelihood turned into a real plan. Maria launched a small online business, selling the crafts she had learned to make. At first, it was small, barely enough to cover the bills, but it was hers. It was a start. What began as a small step forward blossomed into something more. Maria's business began to grow. Slowly but surely, her confidence returned. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Every sale, every positive review was a testament to her strength and resilience. She had a sense of purpose again, and it was all thanks to the kindness of the woman who had taken her in. Maria found herself looking ahead with a new sense of possibility. Her baby, once the source of her fear, now represented her motivation, her reason to build a better life. The bond between Maria and the elderly woman deepened, a friendship built on mutual respect and the powerful force of kindness. In the end, Maria discovered the true power of kindness, the way it could transform lives, heal wounds, and bring hope where there was none. What the elderly woman had given her wasn't just a roof over her head. She had given Maria something far more valuable, the belief that she was worthy of love, of support, and of a future. Maria's life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And with every step she took, she knew that the kindness that had been shown to her would continue to shape the woman she was becoming. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change everything. In that moment, Maria's world came crashing down. The family she had known her whole life, her safety net, her support, was gone. They had cast her out, leaving her alone to face the overwhelming weight of a life she wasn't ready for. She had no home, no direction, and most painfully, no one to turn to. With only her baby in her arms, she felt more isolated than she had ever felt before. Maria wandered through the streets, unsure of where to go. Her mind raced with worries. How would she take care of herself, let alone her baby? Where would they sleep? How could she survive on her own? The world felt like a cold, unwelcoming place. She needed help, but she had no idea where to find it. And then, just as her despair reached its peak, an unexpected figure appeared. An elderly woman, quirky and unpredictable, approached Maria with a calm, knowing gaze. She didn't ask questions, didn't judge, simply extended an invitation. "You look like you could use some help," the woman said, her voice surprisingly warm despite her eccentric appearance. "Come with me. You're not alone." At first, Maria hesitated. She didn't know this woman, didn't know if she could trust her. But the woman's kindness was undeniable, and in a moment of desperation, Maria made a choice. She followed the elderly woman, her only option in a world that seemed to have turned its back on her. The woman's home was nothing like Maria had expected. It was small, cozy, and full of oddities. Brightly colored curtains, shelves lined with strange trinkets, and mismatched furniture. But there was an undeniable warmth to the space. The woman, despite her peculiar ways, offered Maria shelter, food, and most importantly, a listening ear. For the first time in days, Maria felt a glimmer of peace. The elderly woman's eccentricities were a strange comfort in a world that had become so cold. She didn't demand anything from Maria. She simply offered what she could, a space to heal, to rest, to figure things out. The days that followed weren't easy. Maria, still reeling from the shock of being abandoned, struggled to adjust. The woman's ways were unconventional. She didn't give Maria handouts, but instead shared her own wisdom and life lessons. Work with your hands, always keep busy, she would say, encouraging Maria to find purpose in small everyday tasks. A busy mind doesn't have time for despair. Together, the two women faced the judgments of the world. Neighbors whispered as they passed by the woman's house, casting judgment on the teenage mom and her strange companion. But the elderly woman stood by Maria, offering her a quiet, steady strength. They didn't let the world's harshness dictate their lives. Instead, they forged a bond that was uniquely their own. As the weeks went by, Maria began to see things differently. With the elderly woman's guidance, she started to find a sense of independence. She learned to do things for herself, from budgeting money to cooking meals. Her confidence began to grow as she realized she was capable of more than she had ever thought. The elderly woman, with her quiet wisdom, never pushed Maria. She simply gave her the tools to take charge of her own life. Maria was changing. She was no longer just a scared, helpless teenager. She was becoming a woman, a mother who could stand on her own 2 feet. And then one day, something inside Maria shifted. After months of being cared for, of learning and growing under the elderly woman's unconventional guidance, Maria made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. Standing in the middle of the small kitchen, the light from the window casting a warm glow on her face, Maria looked down at her baby, who had been her anchor through all the pain and confusion. She knew she had come a long way since that night she was kicked out. She had found a strength in herself she never knew existed. "I'm going to start over," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "I'm going to build a future for my baby, for me. No more relying on anyone. I can do this." That moment, standing there in that small kitchen, was the turning point. Maria's decision to take control of her life wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving. She began making plans to start her own small business, using the skills she had learned from the elderly woman. She realized that she had more power than she had ever given herself credit for. The world still held challenges, and the road ahead would be far from easy. But Maria was no longer afraid. She had discovered her own strength, her own direction, and with the love and support of the eccentric woman who had saved her, Maria was ready to face whatever came next.